Hello! Today I wanted to talk about the fantasy genre through the years and just kind of the evolution of fantasy as a genre and how it came to be. So, what is fantasy? While the definition of fantasy as a genre has changed throughout the years, as we will see, it is important to recognize that fantasy encapsulates lots of different types of stories. So, that includes legends, folklore, fairy tales, allegory, and dream stories. So the origins of fantasy. The roots of fantasy are myths, so mythology. And fantasy can be traced back to all different cultures' mythologies, including Homer's The Odyssey, Anglo-Saxon mythology, and Norse mythology. European groundwork for fantasy. So European stories such as Arthurian legends and Grail romances, they established tropes of this genre. And then later on in the Renaissance era, the stories that were created really solidified those tropes and created the genre even further with stories such as Ariosto's Orlando Furioso and Edmund Spenser's Fairy Queen. So these types of stories normalize tropes such as heroes going on quests, large-scale adventures scaling huge masses of land, and damsels in distress. In the 18th and 19th century, Gothic novels of the 18th century, such as Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, led the way for Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Bram Stoker's Dracula to bring in their creatures in the next century, solidifying that section of fantasy, kind of a creature fantasy. And then later on as well, ghost stories and romances, they were used to kind of create these concrete fantastic motifs. And they appeared in the earlier works mentioned as well. And then in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this is when fantasy really began to take shape. So John Ruskin wrote The King of the Golden River, and this was one of the first fantasy stories specifically aimed at children. So we're getting that genre of children's fantasy, which is really important because that kind of spans into YA fantasy as a genre, which is a huge moneymaker for the literature industry. And then George MacDonald was a prominent figure in fantasy as well with these stories, and he was often regarded as the first true fantasy author. And something really interesting about George MacDonald, as we'll talk about later, is that he was a huge influence on J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, who began their writing by discussing his works and imitating his style. So some other notable authors of this time, just to kind of put it in perspective on where we are in time, William Morris wrote The Well at the World's End, Hans Christian Andersen wrote The Little Mermaid, Lewis Carroll wrote Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and Rudyard Kipling wrote The Jungle Book. And these all had similar tropes of a protagonist wanting more for their lives than they already have, and that leads them to an adventure where they kind of find the answer inside themselves and they realized it was there the whole time. And as you can see, a lot of these were adapted for Disney movies later on, and that is a common theme with fantasy as well. As fantasy grows and changes in the genre, Hollywood fantasies grow and change as well. So the three major figures that changed the game of fantasy were J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and Charles Williams. So J.R.R. Tolkien, he wrote The Hobbit and subsequently The Lord of the Rings, which was written in stages between 1937 and 1949. He also wrote an influential essay that established the genre on fairy stories. And in his fantasy, he established Wars of Grandeur, which has been a major trope of fantasy ever since. Even George R.R. Martin, who wrote Song of Ice and Fire, has accredited Tolkien to kind of starting the World War-esque trope of fantasy that he uses in his books. Then C.S. Lewis. So he was a scholar, critic, and novelist. He was also a huge Christian apologist. He taught at Oxford at first and then became a professor of medieval and Renaissance English at Cambridge. He wrote a series of 7 novels known as the Chronicles of Narnia, and the most famous one is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This really normalized religious overtones in fantasy, and so later on we see a lot of Christ figures in fantasy, and C.S. Lewis really popularized that. And then Charles Williams. So he wrote The War in Heaven, Many Dimensions, and The Place of the King. He was friends with both Tolkien and Lewis, and they were in a reading group together titled The Inklings. He wrote with religious overtones as well, so he was also part of the movement to popularize Christ figures and religious overtones in fantasy with Lewis. So other influential authors of the time were J.M. Barrie, L. Frank Baum, and Ray Bradbury. So now, Ursula Le Guin is a huge figure in fantasy. She wrote modern fantasy and science fiction, including the Earthsea trilogy, which has been adapted into multiple screenplays, and Gifts. Another huge prominent figure of this time is J.K. Rowling, and she is one of the most popular fantasists today with her Harry Potter series. So this is kind of how fantasy has evolved throughout the years. I hope you learned something. I hope you had fun. And thank you for watching.